So on the Judges, we have gotten through the beginnings, the patriarch era, the Exodus and the conquest. Now we're starting into the Judges, and it will slow down here as soon as we hit the United Monarchy, because then we'll have to take a little more time per section, but we'll actually get through all of the Judges here tonight. So looking forward here, next 2 weeks we don't have any class. In the third week we do have class, and we'll look at Samuel and Saul. Samuel's a transitionary character. Saul is the first king of the United Monarchy, and that will be in the next unit. And then we'll have something on January 12th. Let's see, so for this one you're going to want a few handouts available. You're going to want to have your timeline of the Judges handy. You're going to want your map of the tribal allotments and your map of the Middle East as well. That is the Judges.
Which map of the Middle East?
Anything that's got the Euphrates River on it. So, big map blown out
Fertile
where you can
Crescent.
see the whole Fertile Crescent, yeah. That one would work. There's a color one that's, there you go. That's the nice color one. All right. So in this unit, we're looking at the Book of Judges and also the Book of Ruth. So the way the Book of the Judges is laid out is your first two chapters transition out of Joshua and the conquest and introduce the concept of what they're looking at in the Judges. And then you've got 14 chapters in a row that describe the judges of Israel. And then you have what I call appendices at the end. Judges 17 and 18 has a unique story about the Danites, and that story, as we'll see, seems to fit in towards the beginning of the Judges era, not the end, as does the story about the Benjamites, a little more so. This is in Judges 19, 20, 21. So those are added bonus stories that don't fit under any specific judge per se. And then the Book of Ruth is much like one of these appendices, where it's another story that is just independent of the rest of the storyline, but it's something that takes place, once again, most likely towards the early period of the Judges. And it is David's great-grandmother, and that's one of the reasons why that book is included. Now, the period of the Judges has no shortage of chronology issues. And it emanates from this verse here. It says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. And this means that we have 479 years to work with between Israel moving out of Egypt at the very beginning of the Exodus and Solomon beginning to build the temple of the Lord. One of the other pieces that happens to fit into this is in the Book of Judges, there is only one verse that you can connect to an event outside of the Book of Judges. All the rest of them are just insular and connected to each other, but nothing to the outside. And that happens to be here in Judges 11:21, where it says, the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all his people into the hand of Israel, and they defeated them. So Israel took possession of all the land of the Amorites who inhabited that country, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not deliver them within that time? So that connects to when Sihon was defeated in the 40th year of the Exodus. Otherwise, nothing else in the book of Judges connects to anything else in the chronology of the scriptures. So we know where the judges land, and we know approximately how much time we have allotted for them, but the storyline of the judges doesn't seem to fit within that. I'm going to give you this handout that'll illustrate the challenges of the chronology in the judges period. So, looking at our bigger timeline, we know the Exodus from Egypt starts in 1491, and that event that was referenced by Jephthah happens in 1452. And so we can go 300 years into the future from 1452 to 1152. That is when Jephthah defeats the Ammonites, and he's having that conversation with the king of the Ammonites. And the other fixed event that we know of is the temple construction beginning in 1012 BC. But we already trim off some of that 479 years, because at the front end of it, we have 40 years of the Exodus, and so that trims off a bit there. And then there's the War of the Conquest, which lasts at least 5, 6, 7 years there. And so it ends about 1445. There's an unspecified length of time of peace that the land has and enjoys right after the conquest, and that's not even factored into this worksheet here that I put together. But anyway, from 1445 to 1152, you end up with this 293-year gap, and in the book of the Judges, you have 319 years worth of events taking place if you line them all up sequentially, which is not a given and a guaranteed all the time, but that's the easiest way to read it as it's put together. The bigger challenge actually is on the back end of it, because on the back end of the Judges period, we know how long David's reign was, 40 years. We know that Solomon's reign began 3 years or so before he started building the temple. Saul's reign is usually assumed to be 40 years long, although there is some questions on that based on a verse in 1 Samuel that seems to be corrupted and missing a few pieces. But the rest of the events of the Judges there end up adding up to 191 years, including the length of Saul's reign, and there's only 97 years within which to fit that. So, how you reconcile this is challenging. Nobody does it the same way. James Ussher reinterpreted a few pieces out of the Judges, and instead of having that the land would have rest for 40 years, it was that the land had rest from 40 years. And so that was referencing backwards in time to the last time they had rest. And so that was a way that he was able to squeeze time out of the Judges. It doesn't really make sense with the way the Hebrew works, but that was his reconciliation of it. So the timeline that I produced in the big 11 by 17 formats shows his solution to it. Kind of works. It doesn't actually end up with Jephthah defeating the Ammonites in the right year quite, but it comes close. And the other way that people will try to get these to coordinate is that they'll start seeing some overlap amongst the judges. And so, for instance, some of the minor judges may have been judging while a major judge was also judging in different parts of the land of Israel.
Right.
And then when Jephthah was oppressed by the Philistines and the Ammonites, the oppression of the Philistines would have been on the other side of the land, and that could overlap and be part of the Philistine oppression that was experienced during Samson's days. So that's another potential solution. Without further information outside of the Book of Judges or coming from the Book of Judges, it's really hard to come up with a good resolution. So this just shows and illustrates the difficulty and the challenge. We can kind of skip over it as far as a biblical chronology issue in the sense that because we can connect from the construction of the temple all the way back to the beginning of the Exodus, we have a workaround, and how this resolves can be left on the shelf, I guess. Any questions on the chronology?
No, but I do have a question.
Yeah, question.
Why are they called judges? Because when I was little, I would always hear judges, and I would assume them, or like I would think that they would be someone that people would come to with their problems and then sort them out, like Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
But like Jephthah led them to war, and
Yep.
Samson, I never thought of him as a judge.
Mm-hmm. So some of them did more civil court cases, like Deborah, and others of them don't seem to have that influence, like Samson. He was more just a war leader. So it was kind of a term that was broad, ambiguous. It was kind of like the person who sat in the seat of Moses, essentially, or Joshua, who is a person who's leading Israel in civil matters.
How did people get that job?
Yeah, they usually got fingered by God somehow. They would end up with the responsibility after winning a military victory. So, and then once they died, everybody did whatever they saw fit in their own eyes, and they would end up oppressed again, and then a new judge would arise. So, good question. Alright, so the book of Judges opens up with a large list of land that is yet to be conquered. Because the conquest, while it pushed a lot of Canaanites out, not all of them were fully dispossessed, nor were all of them exterminated. And so there were still portions of Judah, Benjamin, Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, almost all the territory of Asher had to be taken yet, Naphtali, and then Dan as well. And so part of the Judges is establishing the Israelites in the land of Canaan more strongly and continuing with the conquest, which the conquest does not ever actually fully get completed until David takes Jerusalem and subdues the Philistines. So in the book of the Judges, there's this pattern that almost every single one takes. The Israelites forsake God, and then God hands them over to foreigners. And then Israel repents and turns back to God. And then God sends them a judge to deliver them. They have a great victory, and then the land rests from war. And once that generation gets done, then the whole process starts over again. So it's a really challenging book to preach off of a sequence of sermons because every single judge story follows the exact same pattern. So you have the same sermon like every single week, which gets really old really quick.
Yeah, that's been flannel graph.
Yes, that has been flannel graph this last couple months, you're right. But the visual story is a lot more exciting.
That is true.
All right. So looking at the judges, there are major judges and there are minor judges. Major judges include Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, and then Eli is also considered a judge as well, even though he doesn't show up until the book of 1 Samuel. Then the minor judges include Shamgar, Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And they don't tend to even make flannel graph stories, so they are minor judges. Writing them all down.
Just the major ones.
Okay.
That's like something else.
What did Othniel do?
He was the
Were you
first
about to
one.
get into all of
About to get into all of that. Alright, so, starting to look at the major judges. Othniel. This is where you'll want your map looking at the Middle East. Israel gets subjugated by Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. Now the Arameans are where Laban was from and where Abram originally came from. So that's way up by Haran. And where it says Aram Naharaim, the Naharaim is Aram of the two rivers. So this is a kingdom there that is found by the Euphrates River and the Tigris River there. And they sent a very large expeditionary force all the way down to the borders of Egypt and subjugated the Israelites. And this was experienced by Othniel, who was around in the period of the conquest. So this is not that terribly long after the conquest. He was Caleb's younger brother, or his nephew possibly by Caleb's younger brother. The genealogy of Othniel is a little challenging. But anyhow, Israel's subjugated for 8 years. Then God sends Othniel. His name means the Lion of God, and he's like the archetype of the ideal judge. And it goes downhill from him on. So, nephew and son-in-law of Caleb. That's what I read or resolved with last time. After he delivers Israel from the clutches of Aram Naharaim, the land has rest for 40 years, and that's a good long time to live in peace. That establishes a new generation in the land entirely.
What makes him the archetype of judge?
Because he was descended, or he was related to Caleb, who was a hero of Israel, and he also, his name meaning the Lion of God, he has no flaw about him that is stated or noted at all, and so he is like the pristine, ideal judge. Very little is actually said about the battle or the events of the story, so he just gets mentioned as the first one, but he is considered a major one, even though so little is mentioned.
The fact that so little is mentioned says he did it well,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not distinctive, but he got the job done,
Yep.
and it was peaceful.
Yep.
Sometimes less is more.
Yep.
That's
So,
a reference to Ninjago season 6. That book that Jay reads.
so that brings us to our next major judge, Ehud. Now, Ehud is a left-handed Benjamite, and Israelites always raised an eyebrow at left-handed people. They were considered a notch inferior to a right-handed person, and I'm not sure why, but they had this distinct bias against left-handed people. And so Ehud, being a left-handed Benjamite, is a mark against him. So Othniel was actually the tribe of Judah, if I remember right. But then Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin, and it's possible that most of his tribe is already missing because of a rebellion that they had, which we'll get to at the end of the book of Judges. But in any case, he's reacting to Israel's subjugation to Eglon, the king of Moab, which lasted 18 years. He goes with a message, kills Eglon with a dagger, leaves the dagger in Eglon, and then he leads Israel to victory over Moab, and they have rest from war for 80 years, which is a really nice long time of
It's like
rest.
2 or 3 generations.
That's a solid 3 generations there. Yeah. So the third one is Deborah. And this here, the judge has become a woman, which is 1 notch down from Lefty. So in this instance, Israel gets subjugated to Jabin, the king of Hazor. And Deborah is sent. Her name means bee. And the relationship between Deborah and Barak has been one of speculation. Some people think they were married. Some people don't think they were married. It's hard to say because it doesn't actually say. But Barak is the general who leads Israel. But he doesn't want to go to lead Israel in battle unless Deborah goes with.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so she says, very well, I will go with, but because of the way you're going about this, the victory will be considered that of a woman's, not yours. Anyway, so Deborah and Barak lead Naphtali and Zebulun against the commander Sisera, who was the general of Hazor, and they defeat all the iron chariots in the battle at Mount Tabor, which I believe Mount Tabor is on your map there. Should be up in the north. Naphtali, perhaps.
Doesn't Napoli get called up the eastern height?
Mm-hmm.
No,
South of Naphtali.
no, we have Zebulun.
It's in Zebulun.
No, well, I mean, there's a mountain, but it's not named.
I see. Yep, Mount Tabor in Issachar and Zebulun. And it is not labeled on this map. Oh, that's discouraging. Yep, that is Mount Tabor, right there in the northern part of Israel. Anyway, so that battle takes place there, and Jabin is overthrown. Sisera gets killed by Jael the Kenite, and they have rest for 40 years, which is another good long rest from war. Then we shift to Gideon. Israel is oppressed by the Midianite raiders for 7 years. God sends Gideon. Now he is the least of his family, and he's from the weakest clan in Manasseh. So we've gone another notch down.
That's down from a woman.
Yep. A man of no standing and a clan of no standing, and Manasseh is the weaker of the two. Ephraim always had the ascendancy over Manasseh.
Oh, so when you said the oathmeal was like the highest standard, you meant like socially?
In a lot of social and imagery ways that are coming across in the Bible. So you'll see how the final trajectory hits Samson, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's the bottom of the barrel. So let's see. Gideon uses 300 men. He defeats 120,000 Midianites. Ephraim helps him finish off the battle as they are chasing the Midianites off into the wilderness. And unfortunately, Gideon has a very mixed legacy because he makes a golden ephod out of all the golden earrings that they took as spoil in the plunder, and he starts worshiping the golden ephod instead of worshiping God. And then he has a son, Abimelech, who is the son of a concubine from Shechem, and he kills 69 out of Gideon's 70 sons. One of them escapes and runs off into the wilderness, never heard from again. And Abimelech himself makes himself king in Shechem, and so he's kind of an aberrant figure, because here you have in the period of the Judges a king who's ruling for 3 years in Shechem. But not over all Israel, just over a little piece of it. And then he ends up getting killed by a woman who throws a millstone out of the tower. It hits Abimelech's skull and crushes him. And then he tells one of his soldiers to run me through, so it's not said of Abimelech that he was killed by a woman. But that's precisely what Joab and David are talking about later when it comes to Uriah the Hittite, in a matter of how he died. So that didn't end up working for his legacy. Abimelech was known as the king who got killed by a woman, threw a millstone out of the tower.
So his skull was crushed, but he didn't die from that?
Not instantly. Massive head injury will sometimes give you 5 to 10 minutes of coherence before you lights out.
So you didn't get like perfect crush on it, just got
Yep.
hit by enough of it.
Yeah. I heard of a guy who was a roofer in
Do I
Morris.
want to hear this?
It's not too gruesome, no.
Okay.
A roofer in Morris, Minnesota. He fell off a roof and hit his head on the way down. And he was not able to move, but he was able to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. But then his brain swelled up and from the injury, and he didn't recover. He didn't come out of it. He was dead that day. But he was conversational for 10-ish minutes after the injury.
What was he talking about?
I don't know. Not sure what he was able to talk about, but those were his final words, final thoughts. He became a sermon illustration because if you come across a person who's got about 10 minutes of lucidity left, you want to tell them about Jesus. If they don't know about Jesus, that's about all that's important to them at that moment in time, hopefully. So, moving on from Gideon, though, we have Jephthah, and he's another notch down in the social rung, so to speak, because he is the son of a prostitute. Israel,
Worse than some concubines.
yeah, Abimelech's not considered a major judge. Just, not only is he least in his family and the least in his, or least clan of the Manassites, this guy's like, you're not even in a good standing. He is an illegitimate son of Gilead. But he gets summoned by the elders of Gilead because Israel's been subjugated by the Ammonites and the Philistines, and he defeats the Ammonites and delivers the people of Israel. It doesn't say anything about the Philistines, though. And so that is one point that is always made. People think that Jephthah and Samson have a fair amount of overlap. And the other thing, though, is that everything Jephthah does is in the far eastern side. Everything that he does is east of the Jordan River, which it makes sense because that's where the Ammonites are from. And the Philistines are going to be on the west side, down by the coastlands of Judah. And so it's just going to be a very different geography of oppression, so to speak. So this is a good point of likely overlap between a few judges, where you've got Jephthah clearly operating in the east and Samson clearly operating in the west. And Samson is the lowest rung of judges. Not so much because of his birth, because he is the promised son to a couple who are having a hard time conceiving. He becomes a Nazirite, which was a highly esteemed and deeply religious and deeply devoted person. But he is one who lives in a life of extremes. And while he's supposed to be incredibly devoted to God, he's constantly disobeying the law of Moses and living anything but a righteous life. And so he's an interesting type because in some ways he's a type of Christ, and in other ways he's exactly the archetype of, or the antitype of Christ. And his
Doesn't it say that his
wild living.
brothers came out in God's body when he died? So presumably the elderly couple either had more, or it's referring to his cousins as his brothers.
Mm-hmm. Probably his brothers and actual brothers, yeah. And as I was digging through this last, I'm not actually positive that they were an elderly couple. They were just a childless couple.
Okay.
So they may have been elderly, but I couldn't find that the last time I was looking for
Right.
that. So,
So it could just be regular couple, can't conceive.
yep. But anyway, Samson has lots of exploits. Starts off killing 30 men in Ashkelon after his wedding. Then he burns the Philistine fields with foxes. Then he kills 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone. He carries off the gates of Gaza. His major faults, though, is that he's eating honey from the lion's carcass, which not only is that gross, but he's not supposed to touch dead bodies, and that includes a dead body of an animal. He visits a prostitute, and he moves in and cohabitates with Delilah, which is not kosher. That becomes his demise, though. Strength leaves him when his hair is cut, and Delilah is able to draw this out of him. So his eyes get put out, he ends up pushing the grinder, and then when he is taken to the Philistine temple, his strength returns to him because his hair is grown out after several months, and he's able to kill well over 3,000 Philistines by pulling down the temple on top of them all, which was the flannel graph story this morning. Now Eli ends up becoming the final major judge, and this is jumping into 1 Samuel. 1 through 4. And he's an interesting figure because the high priesthood had started in the line of Eleazar. So Aaron had 4 sons. 2 of them get smoked in the wilderness. Eleazar and Ithamar survive and have sons. And Eleazar has his son Phinehas. Phinehas is actually the high priest in some parts of the Judges and is a major character there. By the time we get to the end of the period of the Judges, the high priesthood has shifted out of the line of Eleazar and into the line of Ithamar, and Eli ends up being the high priest. We don't know how that happened, but it did. And he judges Israel for 40 years, once again while they're being oppressed by the Philistines. So here's another opportunity for some serious overlap. There's nothing that says that Samson and Eli and Samuel don't have a lot of overlap. They could have all been at the same time,
Which then implies Jephthah too.
which implies Jephthah too. So that's a possibility, but it's hard to nail down. The only thing you have in common is subjugation by the Philistines. But anyhow, he's serving before the ark, which has been set up at Shiloh for about 300-ish years or so at this point in time. And this is where he raises Samuel. He dies on the day that his 2 wicked sons end up dying in battle, and the Ark of the Covenant gets captured by the Philistines. And so his 40 years is defined by the Israelites being oppressed while he's the judge, and it also is defined by his sons being wicked and him being unable to restrain them from their wickedness, and his blindness near the end of his age, and his inability to hear the Lord. So then we shift into the appendices of the book of Judges. So the Danites have this really interesting episode, and it seems to take place very early in the period of the Judges. They were having a hard time settling in the coastal plain where their tribal allotment originally was, over by where the Philistines landed. And they were not able to push out the people that lived on the coastal plain, and so a chunk of them, but not all of them, go up to Laish in northern Israel, and they conquer that city, and they rename it Dan. And then they actually set up an idol worship there, and Moses' grandson, Gershom, I believe is his name, ends up being the high priest up there in Dan. And Dan ends up becoming a center of idol worship for the land of Israel for several hundred years. It is one of the points of worship later in the divided kingdom period. We'll see golden calves landing there. But not all the Danites ended up in the north, because you remember Samson was a Danite, and he was from the south, and he was in the neighborhood of the Philistines. So some of the Danites stayed in the south, and some of them moved up to the north. So then the second appendix that happens in the book of Judges also takes place very early in the period. I believe this is because Phinehas is still on the scene. And there's this violent homosexual offense that takes place in Gibeah. You've got a traveler who is going through the tribe of Benjamin. He's got his wife or a concubine that he's traveling with. He's taken into the house by one of the Benjamites, and then all the people of the town try to come and assault the guest. They don't get access to the guest who is staying in his house, but they send the concubine out to them, and then she is killed in the assault because she was assaulted by so many of them. And then the Levite who was traveling ended up chopping up her body, sending out a part of it to every single one of the tribes, and gathering all of them to war against Benjamin. And this war goes very badly for the tribe of Benjamin, but also for the rest of the Israelites. This is the first 2 days, and they launch their attack. They get pushed back and defeated by the Benjamites, and this must have been particularly rough on the tribe of Judah because they were in the vanguard of the attack both days. They lose 40,000 soldiers in the first 2 failed attempts. And then on the third day, they pull a ruse very similar to how Joshua defeated Ai, where they set an ambush behind the village, try to draw out the army. Once the army's drawn out, then sandwiches them in between after the city's been torched. And in the course of this battle, only 600 men of the Benjamites survive. Now it is thought that Ehud, the Benjamite, descended from that group of 600 survivors, because he doesn't call upon any of his fellow Benjamites to deliver Israel from the hands of Eglon the Moabite. Instead, he's calling on the tribe of Ephraim, which is just to the north of Benjamin, would presumably have a lot more surviving men able to come out to guard the fords of the Jordan in that battle there that Ehud called forth. So this kind of gives us definite placement towards the early period of the Judges. Interestingly enough, there's a long-term ramification of this. They need to get wives for the Benjamite survivors because they all made a rash vow that none of them would ever give their daughter in marriage to any Benjamite. And so they can't break that vow. And so they first figure out, how are we going to come up with wives? We'll see who didn't send any soldiers to the battle, and Jabesh Gilead did not send any soldiers to the battle. And so then the army of Israel goes over to Jabesh Gilead, razes it to the ground, and takes all the virgins, and they have 400 of them in town that they can hand out as wives to the Benjamites. So they're survivors, but that's still short 200.
That's the most Old Testament way to go about it.
Yep, that is a very Old Testament way to go about it.
Oh.
And you'll notice, though, the descendants in Jabesh Gilead have a strong affinity to Solomon, or not Solomon, Saul, who is a Benjamite king later. And they're the ones that actually rescued his body from the walls that the Philistines had hung it up on.
Wait, so they did like Saul?
Yep, because their town had supplied all the wives for, or 2/3 of the wives for the Benjamites, and so there was a family relationship between the entire tribe of, most of the tribe of Benjamin and the people of Jabesh Gilead. But we'll see more connections there too, coming up soon. So they're still short 200 wives, and they decide that since we can't give our own wives, but we could let them take a wife, we'll just facilitate an opportunity for them to take a wife. And so there's a celebration in Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle is set up, and all of the daughters of the men of Shiloh go out and dance and sing in this procession during the celebration. And so they tell the Benjamites, when you see one you like, run out and grab her and take her away as your wife, and we'll placate the men of Shiloh and make sure that they don't squawk or cause any problems. And so that was how they acquired 200 more wives for the people of Benjamin.
It took some persuasion, though.
Yes, it did. The men of Shiloh were all up in arms. They're taking our daughters. Like, no, you're fine because you didn't give them your daughters.
Not breaking your vow.
Not breaking your vow.
Still lost my daughter.
So then the third appendix from the period of the Judges is the book of Ruth, which once again takes place early in the period. We know this because Boaz is the son of Rahab, who features prominently in the book of Joshua. So Rahab marries Salmon. Two of them have the son Boaz. A fair amount of time goes by because it's thought that Boaz may be in his 60s actually at the time of the book of Ruth. But the story goes, Elimelech leaves Bethlehem of Judah and goes over to Moab because of a famine in the land. Takes his wife Naomi and his 2 sons. His 2 sons die, he dies, and Naomi is left with just 2 daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah. Orpah stays in Moab, and Ruth goes back with her as her daughter-in-law and helps sustain her in her poverty back in Bethlehem. And you see a lot of the social aspects in village life going on in this book. But you have Ruth and Naomi living as beggars, just gleaning from the fields. And She starts gleaning from Boaz's field in particular, and he happens to be a relative of Elimelech, and ultimately ends up marrying Ruth by the end of it. And then they are the paternal great-grandparents of King David. So they have a son named Obed, who has a son named Jesse, who then has David. And there's a lot of space in between those generations to fit them all in, and still have time for them. But I guess David was the youngest son of Jesse, and he had quite a few sons. So Ruth was long gone by the time David ascended the throne. All right, that'll conclude that. Any questions?